September 7th, 1940. 14,000 feet above the English Channel. The bomber's fuselage rattled like a tin drum as the wind clawed at its aluminum skin. Inside the Nakajima G-3M modified bomber, one of several Japanese volunteer observers sent to study the Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign. Major Hiroshi Takayama pressed his gloved hand against the vibrating window and peered into the darkness. Below him, Britain slept under a curtain of blackout darkness. No street lamps, no lighthouses, no glowing towns. Nothing but a vast pool of ink and the distant shimmer of moonlight brushing the surface of the channel. The engines droned like an angry swarm. The cold needled through Takayama's boots as he leaned forward, eyes narrowed, tracking the glow of German bombers heading toward London. And that's when it happened. A sudden bloom of silver arcs lit the sky ahead, British searchlights slicing upward to the night like spears of pale fire. Anti-aircraft guns roared. Black puffs exploded around the incoming Luftwaffe bombers. German pilots began shouting over the radio, their voices clipped and terrified. Takayama flinched as a Heinkel in front of him took a direct hit. Flame swallowed its belly and it spiraled downward, bleeding fire. He looked to his left, then to his right. Nothing but chaos. Chaos that made no sense. "These British," he muttered under his breath. "How are they finding them? In this darkness?" The Luftwaffe pilots had reported this before. Uncanny detection, impossible precision, almost as if the British could see through the night. But Berlin brushed those complaints aside as excuses. Takayama wasn't so sure. He watched another bomber fall. He listened to frantic German voices. He felt something tightening in his gut. This wasn't luck. This wasn't guessing. This wasn't chance. Something was happening in the darkness. Hours later, after slipping back across the channel, the bomber touched down at a dimly lit German airfield in occupied France. The engine sputtered to silence, and the crew climbed out stiffly. Takayama stepped onto the tarmac, his breath fogging in the cold air. German officers rushed toward them, demanding reports. Most blamed navigation errors or poor formation flying. Others cursed the Royal Air Force's growing skill. But one RAF officer's name came up repeatedly, almost with superstition. Doubting system, Doubting's damn network. Takayama repeated the word silently. Network. What network? He walked toward the edge of the airfield where a Luftwaffe captain, still shaking from the sortie, lit a cigarette between trembling hands. "They shouldn't have seen us," the captain whispered, staring at nothing. There was no moon, no fires, no light, and still, he gestured toward the sky with a shaky hand. They were waiting for us. Takayama crouched beside him. "What do you think it is?" The captain exhaled smoke, eyes distant. "Some believe the English have towers, detection towers." He snorted dismissively. "Ridiculous superstition. They're just radio posts, weather stations, nothing more." Takayama didn't respond immediately. He had seen those towers earlier in the war, tall steel lattices rising along the British coastline. The Japanese Navy had studied them before siding with Germany in intelligence exchanges. Their official assessment? Harmless, ordinary, radio communication towers. Nothing strategic. But as he replayed the night's chaos in his mind, something didn't add up. The English always knew when the bombers were coming. They always rose at the perfect moment. And their interceptors, those Hurricanes and Spitfires, seemed to appear out of thin air, as if guided by an invisible hand. Invisible, unseen, but real. Takayama straightened, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "I want a closer look at those towers," he said quietly. The captain laughed. "Why? They're worthless." Takayama didn't smile. He didn't look away from the horizon, and he didn't believe that for a second, because that night, above the channel, he had seen something impossible, something that turned the black sky into a battlefield the British controlled, something no one else seemed willing to admit. Whatever those towers were, whatever the British had invented, it had just saved London from what should have been a devastating attack. And for the first time, Major Hiroshi Takayama felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. He had just witnessed the first crack. Small, invisible, but real, in Japan's understanding of modern war. Something out there was watching, listening, tracking, something the Japanese High Command had laughed at. But after tonight, he wasn't laughing. September 9th, 1940. Ventnor Radar Station, Isle of Wight. Wind slammed against the cliffside like a restless beast as the sea below crashed in white, foaming waves. The radar towers, four narrow steel lattices rising more than 300 feet, stood against the storm like silent sentinels. Their skeletal frames hummed faintly, vibrating with the pulse of an invisible energy. Major Hiroshi Takayama stepped out of the back of a covered truck, mud splashing beneath his boots. A stolen Luftwaffe uniform clung uncomfortably to his body. His forged papers, approved in Berlin for a limited reconnaissance exchange, granted him a narrow window to observe the British coast from a distance under German escort. But he wasn't here for landscapes. He was here for the towers. Those strange, thin giants the British called chain home. He pulled binoculars from his coat and raised them toward the horizon. There they were, strange, geometric, and utterly underwhelming. For towers, each crowned with horizontal rays that looked more like scaffolding than weapons. A handful of brick huts at their base. A modest cluster of camouflage nets. A few trucks. Nothing that screamed strategic miracle. The German officer beside him, Captain Lenz, scoffed. "See, Major? This is what your people worried about." He laughed, motioning toward the structures. "Radio masts. Nothing more. We've flown over these hundreds of times. Harmless." Takayama didn't answer. He stepped closer to the ridge and crouched, letting the salt wind whip across his face. Through the lens, he watched technicians shuffle in and out of the operations building. Some carried clipboards. Others wore headsets, listening intently to something he couldn't hear. Then, unexpectedly, the horizontal antennas on the towers began to rotate, not like searchlights, not like simple broadcast antennas. No, this motion had intention, rhythm, purpose. Takayama leaned forward, adjusting the binoculars. "What is that?" he murmured. Len shrugged dismissively. "Calibration. They use them for tracking storms and ships. That is all." But Takayama wasn't convinced. A station that tracked storms didn't require battlefield urgency. It didn't need constant staffing. And it certainly didn't need heavy anti-aircraft positions hiding under camouflage blinds just 200 meters away. This was a fortress pretending to be a farm shed, a giant pretending to be small. He lowered the binoculars and turned to Lens. How far do these towers reach? For weather? 60 miles, perhaps. Enough for coastal ships. And for aircraft? Takayama pressed. Len smirked. Completely useless for aircraft. Luftwaffe scientists told us so. The frequencies are too crude. The beams too wide. They cannot track anything in the air. Takayama looked again at the towers, at their strange latticework, at the men inside the operations hut, at the rotating beams that swept across the sky in silent, invisible arcs. Something about that confidence worried him. His memory flashed back to the night over the channel. The synchronized British response, the perfectly timed fighters, the searchlights that moved as if guided by an unseen map. If they are so useless, Takayama said quietly, why does the RF scramble fighters exactly when your bombers cross the coast? Lenz's jaw tightened. A small crack in the facade. Takayama didn't miss it. For weeks now, the Luftwaffe had suffered losses that couldn't be explained by luck. British night fighters appeared at the right place, at the right altitude, at the right moment. Not once, not twice, but every night. It was impossible unless the British knew, unless they could see what no one else could. Takayama turned his gaze back to the steel towers, now glowing faintly under the rising sun. "Captain," he said, "do your scientists truly understand how this works?" Lenz chuckled, waving off the question. "Major, radar is a toy. A British toy. Harmless." Takayama didn't correct him. He didn't argue. But as he watched the towers pulse with invisible energy, he felt, for the first time, that he was looking at the future, an invisible battlefield stretching from coast to sky. A battlefield Japan had ignored. A battlefield Germany had underestimated. A battlefield Britain already controlled. And if his instincts were right, Japan's own plans, its night raids over the Pacific, its confidence in striking unseen, were built on sand. He steadied his breath. The wind howled. The towers hummed. And Major Hiroshi Takayama realized something terrifying. War itself had changed, and the rest of the world was still fighting the old one. October 2nd, 1940. Naval General Staff Headquarters, Tokyo. Rain slammed against the windows of the third-floor conference room, streaking the glass like claws dragging downward. In the dim yellow light of the room, senior officers gathered around a long table piled with documents, maps, and intelligence briefs, most of them stamped with the red seal of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Operations Division. Major Hiroshi Takayama stood at one end of the table, his uniform sharp, his posture rigid. He had just returned from Berlin. Jet lag gnawed at him, but adrenaline kept him alert. Across from him sat Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, stern-faced and composed as stone. Takayama laid a single black-and-white photograph on the table. It showed the British radar towers of Ventnor, skeletal, angular, unassuming. A few officers chuckled quietly. Commander Arida Senda smirked. "You crossed thousands of miles for electrical scaffolding?" Brigadier Nakayama leaned forward, amused. "Is this supposed to frighten us, Major?" Takayama felt heat rise under his collar, but he kept his voice calm. "At first glance, the towers appear insignificant, but their purpose is not." Another officer yawned openly. Admiral Inoue raised a hand. Silence returned. "Major Takayama," the admiral said, "explain the tactical relevance." Takayama activated projector. Grainy footage from German reconnaissance aired. British coastlines, rotating antennas, trucks carrying signal equipment, then clips of German bombers, C-111s, fly over the channel, intercepted by RAF fighters rising with uncanny precision. He clicked the next slide. A Luftwaffe bomber spiraling downward in flames. This time, the room grew quieter. "This pattern has repeated for weeks," Takayama said. "British night defenses coordinate too quickly to rely solely on visual observation or acoustic detectors. Something else directs them." He pointed at the image of the radar towers. "These stations, they detect aircraft long before any human can. They track altitude, speed, direction. They predict your path." Commander Senda scoffed. "Impossible. You cannot detect a target at 100 miles with radio waves. Our engineers tested this. The signal would scatter." A British engineer named Robert Watson Watt, Takayama continued, demonstrated otherwise. "They're using radio waves to locate aircraft in the sky." A murmur spread, some doubtful, some irritated. Brigadier Nakayama waved a dismissive hand. "Speculation. Even if true, the British system must be primitive, too crude for guidance." Takayama pressed a button. A new slide appeared. Chain home operator consoles. Wave patterns. Altitude calculations. Bearing plots. "These were taken by German intelligence," he said. "Their system may be crude, but its range is extraordinary. In Berlin, I learned that British radar tracked entire bomber formations before they even crossed the French coast." That got their attention. "Admiral," Inoue leaned forward slowly. "How certain is this?" Takayama hesitated for a moment. Then he told the truth. "As certain as any man can be from observing the outside, but their results speak for themselves." Commander Senda folded his arms. "Even if the British have this machine, how does it concern Japan? Our war will be fought across the Pacific, against Americans, not the British." Takayama replied quietly. "Do you believe the Americans lack the curiosity to copy such a weapon, or improve it?" Silence. A tight, uneasy silence. But it didn't last. Brigadier Nakayama exhaled sharply. "Major, night raids are the future of long-range bombing. Surprise is our greatest ally. No machine can strip us of that." A faint ripple of agreement spread through the room. "And even if radar exists," another officer said, "it cannot stop a determined pilot." Takayama looked around the table, at the confidence, the certainties, the doctrine rooted in tradition rather than adaptation. He realized then that he was speaking a different language. Not Japanese, not military, but the language of the future. A language no one else wanted to hear. Admiral Inoue finally nodded. Major Takayama, we appreciate your report. But until we have proof that this technology threatens Japanese operations, it cannot guide our strategic decisions. Takayama bowed slowly. Yes, Admiral. The meeting ended. Chairs slid back. Papers shuffled. Officers left the room confident in their dismissal. He remained standing, the photo of the radar towers still on the table before him. Small, thin, unimpressive, yet powerful enough to shape the next war. Takayama turned off projector, gathered his files, and stepped into the rain-soaked hallway. Behind him, laughter echoed faintly. The same laughter he'd heard from German officers. The same laughter he'd heard from Japanese commanders. The same laughter that meant danger was approaching unseen. He walked out into the storm, the photograph tucked beneath his arm, if he was right, and the rest of the world continued to ignore this invisible battlefield. Then one day, sooner than any of them expected, Japan's confidence in night warfare would shatter like glass. January 12, 1941. North Sea, 6,000 feet above the waves. Wind hammered the fuselage of a Mitsubishi G-3M bomber as it cut to the winter night, its engines droning like a pair of distant thunderheads. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Kenji Morita tightened his scarf around his neck and scanned the darkness ahead. A moonless sky, clouds drifting like torn cloth, endless black water below. Perfect conditions for a night strike. The bomber was part of Japanese Naval Aviation Detachment operating alongside German units on a limited exchange program, an arrangement meant to expose Japanese air crews to European tactics. Tonight, they were accompanying a formation of German Heinkel bombers on a deep night raid toward British refineries. No lights, no radio chatter, only the soft clicking of navigation instruments and the faint tapping of sleet on glass. Morita checked his wristwatch. Course steady, he said. Altitude holding. The British won't see us coming. His co-pilot smirked. They'll still be asleep when we're above them. Behind them, the bombardier, Petty Officer Jun Sato, hummed softly to steady his nerves. Then, a ripple of radio static cut through the bomber's intercom. A German voice, tense and clipped. Achtung! Enemy fighters, Angels 8 Vector. The message dissolved into static. Morita frowned. That's far too early. We're still over the North Sea. He leaned forward toward the windscreen. Nothing. Pitch black. Not a single silhouette of a fighter. The static flared again. They're climbing right toward. Another burst of static. Then silence. What is going on? Sato muttered. Morita didn't answer. Seconds passed. Then a flash of light. A brief, brilliant glint streaked through the darkness ahead. Tracer fire. What? The co-pilot gasped. How could they find us here? Morita pressed his face to glass. 2 British fighters roared upward from below, their wings catching the faintest hint of moonlight, their engines screaming as they sliced into formation. The German bomber ahead of them banked hard. Too late. A burst of cannon fire ripped through its wing root. Flames erupted. The aircraft spiraled downwards, trailing smoke that glowed blue-white in the night. Sato shouted, Impossible! We were flying in blackout. How did they know where to intercept? Another German bomber dropped altitude desperately, firing a single red flare to warn trailing aircraft. The maneuver only illuminated its position, an invitation for the RAF fighters swooping in like hawks. One fighter cut across the front of Morita's bomber, close enough that he could see the pilot's silhouette inside the canopy. That can't be coincidence, the co-pilot whispered. No lookouts. No searchlights. They just appeared. A chill stabbed down Morita's spine. Radar. It had to be radar. He flashed back to Major Takayama's report, the photographs of skeletal towers. The laughter that followed. That British system, Morita said under his breath. It's guiding them. It must be. His co-pilot shook his head violently. That's superstition. They can't see through darkness. But Morita knew what he saw. The RAF pilots weren't searching. They were hunting with precision. Another bomber exploded overhead, pieces raining down across the sky like burning leaves. The intercom crackled again. All aircraft divert. Divert immediately. Fighters behind you. The formation began to scatter. Too late. Too chaotic. Morita shoved the control stick forward. The aircraft dove hard, its frame rattling, engines howling in protest. Dense clouds swallowed them. Visibility dropped to nothing, but the fighters didn't follow. After long minutes, Morita pulled out of the dive. Silence. Empty sky. The softest of wind. The RAF had broken off. Sato exhaled shakily. Why did they leave? Morita answered without looking back. They weren't hunting us. They were hunting the formation. Once scattered, we weren't worth the fuel. The co-pilot swallowed hard. You think Takayama was right? Morita nodded once. No! He underestimated them. This isn't crude. This is a net. A net they cast over their entire coastline. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Below them, the North Sea rolled quietly, deceptively peaceful. Morita kept his eyes forward, scanning the horizon. For the first time in his career, the darkness of night no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a trap, and the British had learned exactly how to see inside it. March 18, 1941. RAF Fighter Command Operations Room, Southern England. A wall of glowing plots moved slowly across a massive table map. Each marker representing a formation of incoming aircraft. Women of the WAF slid the colored tokens along pre-measured tracks, updating headings and altitude in near real time. Overhead, the rotating sweep of the cathode ray tube hummed softly. From the observation balcony, Group Captain Arthur Blake watched the data unfold with cigarette balance between two fingers. His uniform smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool. No one had slept properly in days, not since the night raid intensified. Behind him, an intelligence officer called out. Chainholm reports another cluster, bearing 069, likely approaching from over the North Sea. Blake took a slow drag, eyes narrowing. Altitude, estimate 10,000 feet and climbing, sir. Very good. Scramble Squadrons 85 and 242. Direct them to intercept point Gamma 5. His voice was calm, almost casual, but his chest thudded with anticipation. Radar had given him something the RAF never had before. Foreknowledge. Not a guess. Not a hope. A certainty. He exhaled, smoke curling through the cool air as the operators moved with mechanical precision. Below, on the floor where chalk maps and counters merged into a web of light and motion, Britain watched the invisible battlefield unfold, and Japan still believed this was nothing more than electrical scaffolding. The same night, North Sea, 10,000 feet, Lieutenant Kenji Morita's G-3M bomber returned to European operations weeks after the first disastrous encounter, but every flight fell heavier. Tonight was no different. The hum of engines, the cold vibration of metal, the faint glow of navigator lamps. Yet something in the air had shifted. The confidence was gone. Ahead of them, dozens of German Heinkels pushed through the cloud cover, unaware that a British plot room miles away had already mapped their entire approach. Morita leaned over the navigation table, examining their time-on-target estimate. 5 minutes until landfall, Sato whispered. Morita didn't reply. He was listening. Listening for the enemy. Listening for the unseen watchers in the dark. Then, a tone flickered across their warning receiver. Short, strange, rhythmic. What is that? The co-pilot muttered. Morita froze. He'd heard that sound once before, a whisper detection, recorded by a German technician during a demonstration. He felt his stomach drop. They see us. The co-pilot blinked. But how? There are no lights, no search. His voice cut off. A British bullfighter tore upward from the clouds like a ghost rising from the sea itself. Its cannons opened fire the moment it cleared the cloud line. Tracer rounds streaked sideways with formation, silent, perfect arcs of red. A Heinkel erupted in an orange blossom of flame. Then another. Then another. Panic swept the formation. Engines roared as pilots swerved wildly, trying to evade unseen hunters. Morita yanked his bomber into a sharp bank, but the night sky was alive with interceptors. Every angle, every altitude. This isn't chance. Sato shouted over the roar. "They're waiting for us. They know exactly when we're coming." Another fighter slashed across their path, close enough that Morita felt its slipstream buffet the bomber. "Break! Break!" he shouted. They spiraled into a dive just as the fighter's cannons tore through the air they'd occupied seconds earlier. The G-3M shook violently, panels rattling, one engine coughing as if trying to spit out the terror lodged in its throat. Below them, Britain's coastline flickered into view, tiny flecks of light from villages hiding beneath blackout curtains. Morita swallowed hard. "We aboard," he said. No one argued. The decision radiated to the German bomber net as well. Pilots breaking formation, fleeing for the safety of the open sea. Behind them, the British fighters pressed the attack until the bombers passed beyond the invisible umbrella that had guided the entire engagement. Radar, chain home, tracking altitude, bearing, speed, painting a path through darkness that only one side understood. Morita stared out the cockpit window as the coastline receded behind them. "We never had a chance," he whispered. Sato leaned back, pale with disbelief. "It's like they were inside our briefing room." Morita didn't answer. He was thinking of Major Takayama, of the laughter that filled the conference room, of the quiet dismissal that seemed unshakable. Except now, they were losing aircraft in the dozens. Now their night strategy was collapsing. And all because they had underestimated a technology they barely bothered to investigate. A technology Britain had turned into its deadliest, most silent weapon. Morita gripped the controls tighter as the wind stormed against the glass. If this kept up, Japan's doctrine of night supremacy would shatter completely. And somewhere in Tokyo, he knew, a major's warning report sat buried in a drawer, ignored, dismissed, laughed at, until tonight. April 4th, 1941. Tokyo Bay Combined Fleet Communications Annex. A cold, metallic hiss filled the intelligence room as operators transferred fresh decrypts from Berlin. Rain drummed steadily against the corrugated roof, a low rhythmic tapping that seemed to mimic the tension in the room. Lieutenant Commander Tadao Ishikawa stood over a stack of reports, the edges of the papers curling slightly from damp air. He was not a man easily rattled, but today his jaw had locked tight. German losses, night raid failures, RAF interception patterns that made no logical sense. He glanced at the latest transmission, stamped with Goring's personal seal. Night operations becoming untenable. Enemy detection capabilities appeared to have expanded beyond visual range. Ishikawa read it twice, then a third time. No notation, no speculation, no arrogance, just a blunt statement. The British can see in the dark. He rubbed a hand across his forehead, pushing sweat and frustration through his hair. The room smelled of ink, wet uniforms, and electric ozone from the warm signal machines lining the walls. A young ensign approached. "Sir, more intercepted Luftwaffe signals. They are requesting analysis from all Axis partners on some type of..." The ensign hesitated, glancing at the unfamiliar term. "Radiolocation." Ishikawa stiffened. "Radar." There was again a word Japan had seen brushed aside and dismissed, a theory relegated to Western experimentation. He gestured. "Bring it here." The ensign handed the coded sheet over. Ishikawa read it silently. British early warning system effective beyond anticipated threshold. Fighters vector with accuracy impossible without electromagnetic detection. Electromagnetic detection. Now the Germans were saying it too. Ishikawa's stomach tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. He had heard this before. Months ago, a quiet report from one of their own officers. Major Takayama recently returned from Europe. He'd tried to explain the towers, the tracking, the precision. They had laughed. And now Goring was sounding the alarm. Ishikawa set the report down and turned toward a metal filing cabinet near the wall. He opened the bottom drawer. There, half buried beneath supply assessments and organizational directives, lay Takayama's original document. A single sheet of paper slid free. Black and white photographs of the chain-home towers stared up at him. Tall, skeletal, unthreatening. Scaffolding, they had called it. Ishikawa read through the summary again, his pulse quickening. Altitude measurement, bearing tracking, long-distance detection up to 120 miles. The exact capabilities British radar had just proven in real combat. A memory flickered in Ishikawa's mind, an officer snorting dismissively during Takayama's briefing. Electrical scaffolding cannot bring down aircraft, yet bombers were burning over the North Sea. German airmen were dying with no idea how they'd been found. Entire night operations were collapsing before they even crossed the coast. He closed the drawer slowly. A sinking realization settled in his chest. Japan had made a catastrophic assumption. That technology they did not understand could not possibly threaten them. He looked up. "Ensign," he said quietly, "assemble the strategy division officers immediately." The ensign saluted and hurried off. Ishikawa stared at the radar photos again. The towers looked fragile, ordinary, almost laughable, yet they had turned darkness into daylight, night into battleground, surprise into vulnerability, and Japan had entered the future blind. The same night, Pacific coastline Japanese home islands. Major Takayama, still alone on a cliff overlooking the waves. The sky was black except for faint pinpricks of starlight shimmering above the vast, cold sea. He hadn't been told what was coming, but a summons to the strategy division at dawn meant one thing. Someone had finally read his file. Wind whipped at his coat. Sea spray dampened his hair. The rhythmic roar of waves below sounded like distant artillery. He closed his eyes. How many warnings had he tried to give? How many times had he been dismissed? Behind him, the lights of the base flickered softly. Operators inside were preparing for the next round of exercises, confident that discipline and bravery were enough to face whatever the West might field. Takayama exhaled slowly. Some threats couldn't be met with courage. Some couldn't be fought with doctrine. Some required understanding. The ground trembled faintly as a patrol truck approached. A young officer stepped out. "Major Takayama," he said, "the Admiral requests your presence at headquarters." Something urgent. Takayama turned toward the truck. He didn't know exactly what had happened over the North Sea, but he knew the consequences. Japan's night strategy had just died, and the world of warfare had changed, silently, invisibly, beneath their feet. October 13th, 1940, 22:41 hours. The English Channel, 9,000 feet. The clouds over the channel hung like dark curtains, swallowing moonlight and swallowing sound. A formation of 9 Heinkel He-111s pushed westward, engines droning a steady, confident hum. In the lead bomber, Hauptmann Erich Kellerman checked his maps with a practiced glance, the red glow of the cockpit light reflecting in his goggles. They had flown this route a dozen times. They had struck Portsmouth, Southampton, Bristol. They had slipped through British night defenses as though the island were blind. But tonight felt wrong. The radio crackled, then went dead, not jammed, not broken, just silent, as if the channel itself was holding its breath. Kellerman frowned. Behind him, the bombardier adjusted his drift meter. The viewer, hover in the narrow space between the pilot's seats, watching the men work, listening to every mechanical click and every tightening breath. The bomber vibrates with the beating of its engines, but beneath that, there is a tension none of them can identify. Then, a voice bursts over the intercom. "Aircraft at 3 o'clock. Fast movers." Kellerman twists in his seat, scanning the night. But there is nothing, only blackness. The Heinkel's crew peers through frosted glass, waiting for the first glint of a British fighter's exhaust. Instead, what comes next is stranger. A sudden beam of white light streaks across the sky. Then another, then 2 more. Not searchlights, not tracers. Schwarm. "They're splitting us up," the navigator shouts. The formation scatters. Instinct takes over. The British are no longer stumbling in the dark. They are hunting. Miles away at RAF Tangmere, the operations room hums with activity. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Denholm, headset pressed to his ear, listens as radar operators shout bearings from their screens. Raid approaching grid 7. Height 9,000. Speed 150. Plotters move markers across the large circular map table with long wooden rods. The lines converge. The German bombers are no longer invisible shadows. They are points of light tracked with cold precision. Denholm slams the alert button. Scramble! Scramble! Get the Hurricanes up now. Outside, propellers roar to life. The 601 Squadron Hurricanes lift into the dark sky like arrows fired upward. Back over the channel, Kellerman's Heinkel jolts violently. Near miss from cannon fire. The crew erupts into frantic shouts. You feel the plane shudder beneath your feet. Tools rattle. Loose cartridges roll across metal flooring. Where are they? I can't see them, the tailgunner screams. The British fighters dive out of the night itself. No lights, no silhouettes. Just a sudden flash of muzzle fire streaking past the fuselage. Because radar hasn't merely found the bombers. It has guided the Hurricanes exactly where to be. Inside a radar hut near Dover, 2 young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force decipher the returning signals. Their fingers move quickly over the plotting board. Slopey High reports 3 bogies slipping south. Warren 238 Squadron. This coordination, this speed, this precision, it was exactly what the Japanese observation teams in Europe ignored. They had seen the tall steel towers, the rotating dishes, the unfamiliar oscillating equipment, but dismissed it all as British eccentricity. Back in the Heinkel, Kellerman finally sees his attacker, just a split second before bright tracer rounds rip through the starboard engine. Flames burst outward, licking the wing. The bomber tilts. Alarm scream. The flight engineer fights to shut off the fuel line. Kellerman's voice breaks with panic. We've been found. How'd they find us? Another British fighter swoops in, cannon fire stitching across the fuselage. The Heinkel's glass canopy explodes inward. Wind screams through the cockpit. You brace as if you're inside the aircraft yourself. The entire squadron is unraveling. Bombers peel away. Engines fail. Crews bail out into the freezing black waters below. For the first time, the Luftwaffe's night tactics, once unstoppable, are collapsing. Not because the British had more aircraft, not because their pilots were better, but because of something the Germans still didn't fully comprehend. A silent, invisible net stretched across the coast, a technology that the Japanese had seen months earlier and laughed at. Kellerman's burning Heinkel drops altitude fast. He grips the yoke, knuckles white, breath shaking. Smoke fills the cockpit. Oil splatters the windshield. Below, the lights of southern England flicker like distant embers. Mayday, mayday. His voice cracks, but there is no answer, only static. Then the bomber meets the sea, and the channel goes silent again. The first night Germany realizes something is fundamentally wrong. This is the beginning of the unraveling. But the Japanese, watching from afar, would not understand why until it was far too late. October 15th, 1940. Berlin, German Air Ministry Headquarters. Rain hammered the steel roof as Major Katsuhiro Takeda, a Japanese military observer assigned to Luftwaffe, walked briskly through the polished corridor. His boots clicked in sharp rhythm, echoing beneath the tall ceilings. Under his arm, he carried a leather-bound folder stuffed with handwritten notes, reconnaissance sketches, and intercepted German after-action reports. Takeda had spent 2 weeks embedded with German night bomber units. He had interviewed shaken crewmen, walked the wreckage fields, and listened to frustrated Luftwaffe commanders grumble about invisible British eyes. Everything pointed to one truth. Britain was seeing them long before they reached the coast. He entered the dimly lit briefing room. Cigarette smoke curled in lazy spirals above a table where German officers sat hunched over charts. Among them was Oberst Friedrich Korner, a stern-faced strategist with silver hair that caught the lamp glow. Takeda bowed slightly. Oberst Korner, thank you for receiving me again. Korner grunted. If you've come to ask how we lost 9 Heinkels in one night, we are still determining the cause. Takeda opened his folder. I believe I can explain. The room fell quiet. He placed a crude pencil sketch on the table. A tall lattice tower, angular, crowned with 4 horizontal arms. The same structure he had seen along the English coastline and casually dismissed weeks earlier. It's the British towers, Takeda said. One of the German captains scoffed. The radio masts? They're primitive. We studied them last year. Takeda shook his head. No, they are not radio masts. They are eyes. He tapped the sketch. This is how your bombers were found. Coroner lifted the page closer to the lantern light. Explain. Takeda inhaled slowly, choosing his words. My engineers in Tokyo have described a new theory, radio detection. If the British have mastered it, they can measure reflections from aircraft. That means they can see us, Coroner finished, face tightening. Yes, at night, at long distance, even in cloud. The officers exchanged troubled glances. This was not a possibility they had taken seriously. Takeda added, Your reports show their fighters intercepted the exact altitude and speed of the bombers. That cannot be coincidence. Coroner exhaled harshly. If this device works, it destroys our advantage. The German staff began debating in rapid-fire bursts of frustration, denial, and disbelief. But Takeda was already thinking beyond Germany. Japan had naval pilots training for nighttime carrier operations. Japan had plans for future raids across the Pacific. Japan believed Western technology was clumsy, easy to outmaneuver through speed and spirit alone. But those steel towers, the ones he ignored as British eccentricity, now stood in his memory like warning beacons. Takeda returned to his hotel that night and wrote a 30-page report for the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff. He included detailed observations, British radar tower positions, notes on Luftwaffe bomber losses, urgent warnings, a clear recommendation, develop countermeasures immediately. He worked until dawn, translating German terminology into careful Japanese script. He sealed the envelope, stamped it, and placed it with dispatches bound for Tokyo. As he pressed wax over the seal, he murmured to himself, They won't believe me. And he was right. 3 weeks later in Tokyo, his report was opened in a polished conference room overlooking the Imperial Palace grounds. Senior officers skimmed it with raised eyebrows. One chuckled. Detection at 80 miles? Preposterous. Another waved a hand. England is desperate. They bluff to intimidate us. A third officer tossed a report aside. Even if these towers work, they cannot stop a determined attack. Westerners rely on machines. We rely on spirit. A room of nodding heads. Takeda's warnings were buried under assumptions, dangerous, confident assumptions, just like the Luftwaffe's. Radar, dismissed as an odd British curiosity, faded from their priority lists. But across Europe, the German commanders were experiencing something Japan refused to imagine. Technology was changing the nature of war. By the time Japan understood what radar truly was, it would already be too late, because in another theater, far from the gray skies over Britain, a new enemy had radar, too, the United States, and they weren't laughing. December 20th, 1940, south coast of England, Royal Air Force Sector Station, 23:41 hours. The cold bit sharply as Flight Lieutenant Henry Caldwell stepped out onto the open tarmac. Frost glistened across the concrete, like powder glass, reflecting the amber glow of the hangar lamps. His breath puffed in white bursts, drifting upward into the darkness where the distant hum of engines vibrated in the air. He lifted his headset. Filter room, this is Night Watch. Report. A calm female voice crackled back. WAF Corporal Alice Harrow, her tone steady despite the tension filling the operations room behind her, picking up faint returns on the coastal line. Bearing 247. Altitude roughly 9,000 feet. Probable bandit formation. Numbers? Caldwell asked. A beat of silence. Multiple echoes. Possibly a full raid. Caldwell closed his eyes briefly. Another night. Another test of Britain's new secret weapon. Understood, he replied. Scramble the bullfighters. Inside the operations room, young women in headsets tracked green blips sweeping across an illuminated map table. Thin wooden rods pushed markers representing enemy aircraft, rows of them, approaching the coast. The room pulsed with quiet intensity, the only light coming from desk lamps and the glowing screens of early cathode radar displays. Corporal Harrow tracked the dots carefully. Their course is steady, she said. "They don't know we see them." Caldwell stepped into the hangar as two Bristol Beaufighters rumbled to life, their engines growling deeply. Pilots strapped into their seats, goggles down, hands firm on the controls. Each aircraft carried heavy nose-mounted cannons, absolutely lethal at close range. They didn't have to search blind anymore. Radar told them exactly where to go. Night watch to Bravo Squadron. Caldwell spoke into his mic, Vector 312. Climb to 10,000. You'll intercept within 6 minutes. Roger, Night watch. A pilot responded calmly. 10,000. On our way. The Beaufighters began rolling, lifting off into black sky. Their silhouettes vanished quickly, swallowed by darkness. Inside the German formation miles away, the atmosphere was very different. Aboard Heinkel, he won 11 number 4. Lieutenant Franz Meller frowned at his instruments. The night was perfectly still. The stars were sharp. And yet, radio interference again, he muttered. Same as 2 nights ago. The navigator, Gefreiter Otto, tapped the screen gently. Could be weather. No clouds, Meller said. No wind. Something is wrong. In the dorsal position, the gunner suddenly stiffened. Sir, I feel like something is out there. Meller laughed lightly. It's night. Everything feels like something is out there. Yet in the back of his mind, unease gnawed. The last 3 raids had lost aircraft. Not to flak, not to searchlights, to something invisible, above the English Channel. 23:58 hours. The Beaufighters sliced through the night, guided by the calm, steady voice of Corporal Harrow. Bandits now bearing 280. Maintain altitude. You are 5 miles off. The lead pilot, Flight Officer Daniel Price, clicked twice in acknowledgement. He peered into the darkness ahead. Nothing but endless black. Then, his radar operator whispered from behind him, Contact, 2 o'clock high. There, faint outlines against the stars. A formation of Heinkels. Completely unaware they were seconds from doom. Target acquired. Price murmured. He pushed the throttle. The Beaufighter dropped in from above and behind, its cannons lighting the sky with blazing streaks. The first Heinkel erupted in flame. The second spiraled downward, engines screaming. Gunners fired wildly into the void, hitting nothing. Meller's cockpit lit up as tracers slashed past. What? Where are they? He yelled, jerking controls. But the enemy was invisible until the moment they struck. His gunner's voice cracked through the intercom. They're tracking us in the dark. How? There was no answer. The British didn't need moonlight, searchlights, or luck. They had radar. Back at the sector station, Corporal Harrow watched new blips scatter across the screen. Bandits breaking formation, she reported, some descending rapidly. Caldwell exhaled slowly. It's working, he whispered. My God, it's really working. He looked toward the horizon. For the first time in months, the night sky didn't feel like an enemy's weapon. It felt like Britain's. January 7th, 1941. Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff Office, Tokyo. 9-12 hours. A faint winter haze hung over Tokyo as senior officers of the Kaigun Kokuhanbu gathered around a long lacquered table. Maps of Europe lay unrolled before them. Britain's coastline sketched with neat brushstrokes, dots marking known RF air bases, shipping lanes, and suspected anti-air defenses. Rear Admiral Atsushi Uka tapped the map with a slender wooden pointer. We have received another report from Berlin, he said. The Luftwaffe lost 9 aircraft in a single night raid last week. His voice tightened. London was not illuminated. No searchlights. No moon. Yet British fighters found them in the dark. A murmur passed through the room. Lieutenant Commander Masato Ishimura, a slender officer with sharp eyes, leaned back in his chair. Perhaps the Germans exaggerate? They are frustrated. Winter affects instruments. Air crews become careless. A few officers nodded. The same skepticism that had led them to dismiss the British towers months before still lingered. Uka, however, did not look convinced. He reached for a folder, thick, weathered, sealed with a red cord. From inside, he withdrew a series of photographs. Grainy images of tall British towers rising over the chalk cliffs and beaches of England. Lattice structures with rotating antenna arrays. Chain home, he said quietly. British long-range detection. Ishimura frowned. We've heard rumors. It is merely early warning listening equipment. Crude. Limited. Uka slid a second photo across the table. This one of a Luftwaffe reconnaissance report. The description beneath read, radar installation, range unknown, possibly use of direct night fighters. Silence dropped over the room like a heavy cloth. They're using these towers to track aircraft, Uka continued. Not just hear them, see them, at night, at range, before they reach the coast. One younger officer scoffed. This is impossible. No nation can see through darkness. These towers, he pointed dismissively at the photos, are too simple. Uka raised an eyebrow. Simple is often what makes something dangerous. He lifted a final sheet of paper. Decrypted German correspondence. Our bombers are being intercepted with uncanny precision. Britain possesses a new instrument. The room stiffened. Even Ishimura no longer looked comfortable. Flashback, 6 months earlier, August 1940. Japanese Naval Aviation Technical Bureau. Back when intelligence first sent word of strange British towers on the coast, the analysis had been far more casual. Engineers studied the sketches and ruled them insignificant. Primitive radio direction finders, nothing more. Ishimura himself had once held a memo in his hand dismissing the towers as non-critical structures for signaling. He had laughed, along with the others. No radar, no threat, nothing to worry about. Now, those same towers were systematically unraveling Germany's night strategy. Tokyo, present moment. Uka placed both hands on the table. Gentlemen, we made an error. Even admitting that was bold, dangerous, but necessary. The British have developed a detection method beyond our predictions, and Berlin's losses indicate this capability is improving. He circled one of the tower photos with his pointer. These towers are the reason their night fighters strike with such precision. The British can track incoming bombers before they cross the channel. They vector fighters directly into position, even in complete darkness. The officers exchanged glances, this time filled not with doubt but concern. And the Germans? Ishimura asked quietly, what do they say now? Uka looked down at the paper. They say the raids are becoming untenable. They do not understand how Britain always seems to be waiting. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ishimura, his earlier arrogance fading, said, we underestimated them. Uka nodded. And that, gentlemen, is how empires fall. Not through overwhelming force, but through small things we choose to ignore. He tapped the photo of a British radar tower one last time. A simple structure, lattice metal, antenna on top, guards who barely know what they're guarding. And yet, he inhaled deeply. This is what is turning the night sky against the axis. Outside, the winter wind swept across the courtyard of the Naval Staff Building. Flags rippled. Officers hurried to their duties. But inside that quiet room, dawn was breaking on a realization that could no longer be laughed away. Japan's commanders finally understood. The British towers they mocked were not relics. They were eyes, and the Allies could see in the dark. January 12th, 1941. Dover Cliffs, England, for 26 hours. The wind howled up the white cliffs, carrying with it the taste of salt and distant gunpowder. A faint orange glow lingered far out on the channel, burning wreckage from the night's failed raid drifting on the waves. At the base of a towering steel lattice, one of the original chain-home radar stations, a group of technicians hurried between concrete bunkers. Their boots crunched over frost as they checked cables, tuned receivers, and scribbled figures on clipboards with numb fingers. Inside the main operations hut, a young engineer named Arthur Mills leaned close to the glowing cathode screen. His eyes tracked a faint sweep of light across the dark, circular display. To any outsider, it looked like noise, static, a ghost of electricity. But Mills saw patterns. He saw movement. He saw enemy aircraft before anyone else in Britain could. Return strength increasing on bearing 183, he murmured. Looks like stragglers heading home. Behind him, Sergeant Emily Hayes wrote quickly, relaying the information to Fighter Command. Her pencil tapped the paper rapidly. "Another clean intercept last night," she said without turning. "Bravo Squadron got them before they hit land." Mills nodded, though his expression remained somber. "We lost good men building these towers," he said. "People forget that. Bombings, accidents, experimental gear burning out, and taking huts with it." Hayes glanced up at the towering structure just outside, the giant steel spine of the British coast. "But it's paying them back now," she said softly. "Every night." Mills exhaled, fogging the cold screen. "That it is." Tokyo, same day, 1317 hours. Imperial General Staff Intelligence Wing. Lieutenant Commander Ishimura stood alone near a high window. The winter sun cast long slashes of light across the polished floor. In his hand lay a new report from Berlin. British night fighters continued to intercept with impossible precision. Impossible. That word again. But it wasn't impossible, not anymore. Now, in hindsight, it was obvious. He closed his eyes, recalling their first intelligence sketch of a radar tower. At the time, it had been just a drawing of a tall structure with metal beams, electrical lines, and a small operations building. How could such a simple-looking thing overturn strategies forged by the world's most formidable air forces? He thought of Admiral Ucca's words. Simple is often what makes something dangerous. And now Germany, proud, powerful Germany, was being forced to reckon with that simplicity. Night after night, their bombers were torn apart by interceptors guided by radar beams they could neither see nor counter. Ishimura returned to the table and added his signature to a formal recommendation. Japan must begin immediate research into electromagnetic detection systems. It was the first time such a recommendation had been approved without resistance. The mockery was gone. The laughter had died weeks ago. Now there was only urgency, a dawning awareness that Britain had quietly stepped into a new age of warfare. Back in England, 5:41 hours. Chain Home Tower number 17. The dawn began to rise, pale and thin, over the radar array. Arthur Mills stepped outside, stretching stiff shoulders. The tower loomed above him, its edges catching the first threads of light. "You ever think about what the Germans must make of all this?" Sergeant Hayes asked, stepping beside him. Mills smirked slightly. "I imagine they're very confused." "They must be furious," she said. Bombing in the dark was their greatest advantage. Mills looked up at the giant antenna, turning slowly in the morning breeze. "Well," he said, "not anymore." Hayes chuckled softly, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "You think they know it's radar?" "Some of them must suspect," he said. "After enough failed raids, anyone would." He paused, watching the horizon brighten. "But they can't see it, can't hear it, can't shoot it, and that must be maddening." Hayes exhaled, relief and pride mingling in her breath. "Silent victory," she whispered. "Silent," Mills said, "but powerful. Berlin, that same night. Luftwaffe Planning Wing. General Major Joseph Kamhuber, the man tasked with saving Germany's night bombing campaign, stood over his own map table. Black pins, representing lost Heinkels, clustered over the channel like a spreading bruise. He studied the coast of Britain. Those tall radio towers. For months, they'd been dismissed as crude, antiquated structures. Markers. Communications posts. Now, Kamhuber clenched his jaw. "They guide the fighters," he muttered. "It must be so." His aide stepped forward timidly. "Sir, shall we begin developing countermeasures?" Kamhuber didn't turn. "Yes," he said quietly. "Immediately, and pray we are not too late." Across thousands of miles, Tokyo, Berlin, London, the same truth hung heavy in the air. The towers everyone mocked had rewritten the rules of war. They were no longer curiosities, no longer mysteries, no longer jokes. They were the reason entire air fleets were failing, and their presence marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one fought not only with bombs and bullets, but with waves of invisible energy that could decide the fate of nations. January 18th, 1941. Somewhere over the North Sea, 22:03 hours. The Heinkel He-111 droned steadily through the darkness, its engines humming a low mechanical lullaby. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Franz Miller wiped condensation from the canopy with the back of his glove. The icy wind outside pressed hard against the fuselage, rattling loose panels and sending a faint vibration through the pilot's seat. Below them lay nothing but black ocean, stretching endlessly toward England. Navigation check. Miller said quietly, "On course, heading 190, when replied, studying a dimly lit map balanced on his knee. Expected landfall in 20 minutes. The gunner behind them, hunched over his ventral sight, muttered, "Feels wrong tonight." Everything felt wrong these nights. Miller didn't say it aloud, but they all knew. The air was colder, the silence stretched longer, and the sky around them, once their safe, hidden sanctuary, felt watched. He remembered their first night raid months earlier, how confident they'd been, untouchable in darkness. Now, darkness felt like a trap. Chain home station number 2, Norfolk coast, 22:19 hours. A soft pulse of light swept across the radar screen in a darkened hut, washing the walls in faint green. Technician rose whitely, barely 19, and clutching a pencil worn to a stub, leaned in. "Multiple returns approaching from the northeast," she whispered. Her supervisor, Flight Sergeant Grant Wallace, stepped beside her. "Altitude, 8, maybe 9,000 feet. Wallace nodded, marking the data and flipping a switch on the wall. A red light blinked to life, signaling fighter command. Information moved fast, faster than any bomber could hope to outrun. Behind Rose, 3 WAF operators began relaying bearings and estimates onto a backlit plotting table. Their hands moved quickly, almost rhythmically, like dancers in a perfectly timed sequence. None of them could see the approaching German aircraft, but they knew exactly where they were. Plot updated. Rose said. Wallace glanced at the numbers. "They'll cross the coast in 13 minutes. He lifted the phone. "Alert Bravo and Delta squadrons. RAF Coltishall. 22:32 hours. Engines roared to life. Splashes of fire bursting from exhaust manifolds as for bullfighters rolled from their shelters. Leading them was Squadron Leader Robert Hale, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that never seemed to blink during combat. He tightened his harness, checked his altimeter, and glanced at the dim red glow inside the cockpit. "Night watch. This is Falcon Leader," he said. "We're airborne." Corporal Harrow's calm voice replied through static. "Falcon Leader, Vector 175. Bandits approaching coast at 9,000 feet. Interception window 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Hale repeated to himself. Plenty of time. He pushed the throttle forward. The bullfighters climbed sharply, engines howling as they knifed into the night. No searchlights. No sound cues. Only the invisible lines of radar guiding them. "You ever think," Hale's radar operator murmured, "what it must feel like for them?" "What?" "To fly into an ambush you can't see." Hale didn't answer. "North Sea, Mellor's Heinkel. 22:41 hours. Went lean close to the glass in the navigator's pit. We're approaching the coast." Miller nodded, tightening his grip on the controls. "Stay sharp, all of you. Gunners ready?" "Ready." The dorsal gunner answered, shifting the MG-15. But what were they aiming at? They hadn't seen a British fighter on approach in weeks. Just muzzle flashes out of nowhere. Just death out of the dark. Went checked the stopwatch. Another 2 minutes until... He never finished. The bullfighter dropped through the cloud layer like a silent blade. RAF intercept. 22:43 hours. Falcon Leader aligned behind the Heinkel formation. "Target in sight," Hale said. 2 o'clock low. He eased the controls, bringing his cannons to bear. The radar operator whispered, "Range 300 yards. Hale exhaled slowly. "Engaging." The night exploded. For 20 millimeters, a Spano cannon spat fire. Bright, brief flashes inside endless darkness. Shells ripped into the nearest bomber, tearing aluminum fins into ribbons. Flames blossomed instantly, trailing behind the aircraft like a string of molten beads. "Hit confirmed," Hale said. He banked left, preparing for a second run. Two more Heinkels broke formation, panicked. "Where are they?" A German voice screamed through Meller's intercom. "Above us," another cried. "No, behind, no." They didn't know, couldn't know, not until the moment fire burst through their wings. Meller yanked the controls, stomach flipping as his aircraft dove. "Drop altitude," he shouted. "Drop now." Tracer rounds sliced past the nose like streaking meteors. His gunner fired blindly into the dark. "Can't see them. Can't see anything." Back at Fighter Command, 22:45 hours. Rose whitely watched the blips scatter across the radar screen. Some faded quickly. Others veered sharply. Two vanished altogether. "Looks like intercept successful," Sergeant Wallace murmured behind her. Rose didn't smile. None of them did. War did not reward celebration, but it rewarded effectiveness. And tonight, like so many nights recently, radar had turned the sky into a battlefield only Britain could navigate. North Sea, Meller's Heinkel. 22:49 hours. Smoke filled the cockpit, went coughed violently, covering his mouth with a sleeve. "We're hit," he rasped. Oil pressure dropping. Meller fought the controls. They'd mocked those towers, laughed at them, dismissed them, and now the towers, silent, skeletal, unassuming, were killing them one by one. "Prepare to ditch." Meller yelled, voice cracking. His bomber descended toward the black, icy ocean. The sky behind them flashed again, a second Beaufighter lining up. Meller closed his eyes. How do they see us? The answer was a whisper carried across thousands of miles. Radar, the unseen eyes of Britain. December 22nd, 1941. RAF Fighter Command Operations Room, Uxbridge, 1:14 hours. The giant plotting table glowed under dim lamps as another cluster of red markers slid across the map of the English Channel. A WAF plotter called out, voice steady but tight with urgency. "Raid, 20 plus. Height, unknown. Speed, 300 knots. Bearing, due north." The controllers exchanged quick glances. They'd seen this pattern for a week now. Small, fast formations slipping across the channel in the darkest hours of the morning. The Japanese weren't physically here, of course. These were Luftwaffe aircraft, Heinkel and Dornier crews. But the strategy behind the chaos? The sudden shift to precise night strikes? That was unmistakably Japanese-inspired. For months, German officers returning from Tokyo had bragged that Japanese naval aviators were masters of night warfare, capable of hitting ships in pitch-black seas and descending on unprepared enemies like phantoms. The Japanese had mocked the British radar network openly, labeling the tall mast telephone towers and weather poles. And now their doctrines, tightly studied by the Luftwaffe, were guiding these winter raids. And yet, every raid for the past 10 nights had failed. On the far side of the channel, the Luftwaffe crews didn't know why. Inside the Uxbridge bunker, the truth pulsed on a circular green screen, silent but powerful. Radar. Wing Commander Charles Farnham leaned over the plotting table, rubbing his temples as another bogey cluster flickered into existence on the room's side display. Filter room confirms the new frequencies holding steady, a signals officer reported. No interference. No jamming. Good. German technicians had been hunting for ways to blind the chain home system for months. So far, the British countermeasures were holding. So far, radar remained a quiet spear detecting every enemy aircraft crossing the channel. Scramble 32 Squadron, Farnham ordered, vector 270 degrees. Angels 15. Intercept before they hit Dover. Phones rang. Lights flashed. Airmen sprinted. Another night raid. Another night. The Japanese would have scoffed at radar. Right up until its operators pointed fighters straight at them. Over the English Channel. 1:27 hours. In the cockpit of a Dornier, due 217, Oberleutnant Hans Meissner stared through the darkness. The channel below was invisible, a featureless void. He glanced at the luminescent compass, then the stopwatch dangling from a leather strap. He was flying blind. Japanese naval instructors had praised night intuition, teaching aircrews to trust darkness, speed, and surprise. The British, they said, were helpless without daylight. But Meissner didn't believe in intuition. He believed in instruments. He believed in preparation. And right now, none of it mattered. They were being hunted. Another one! 6 o'clock low, his rear gunner shouted. Tracer fire streaked past the tail. Meissner rammed the throttle forward. How are they finding us? The gunner yelled. There's no moon. Meissner didn't have an answer. The Japanese advisors in Paris had insisted the British couldn't track aircraft at night. They'd said radar was primitive, unreliable, overhyped. Yet German bombers now fell to invisible pursuers night after night. Something was wrong. Something big. And the British weren't talking about it. Dover radar station, 1:29 hours. The rotating beam swept across the screen, producing a faint cluster, then another, then a larger mass of returns approaching the coast. Radar operator Alice Hayes adjusted the sensitivity knob. The room hummed with electricity, equipment warming the air. She'd grown used to the rhythm of the night raids. Detect, track, report, hand off. But tonight felt different. The raid was trying to split. 3 prongs. One toward Canterbury. One toward Ashford. One creeping toward the dark western edges of London. Control, this is Dover. Confirmed split raid. Vectors inbound in 3 separate waves. She watched the blip shimmer, move, change course. The enemy commander was getting desperate. They were no longer flying straight lines. No longer trusting the silent night, tactics praised by their Japanese advisors. They were zigzagging, diving to low altitude, climbing again, scattering, reforming, trying everything to break radar's grasp. But the green screen showed it all. Every turn, every climb, every desperate evasive measure. Alice pressed her headset tighter. Their lead formation is about to overshoot Canterbury, she said. Redirecting night fighters now. The British had learned, too. Radar didn't just warn anymore, it guided. The Luftwaffe still thought radar could only detect. By the time they realized it could direct fighters into the exact dark patch of sky the enemy occupied, it was already too late. Over Kent, 1:36 hours. The first British night fighter pair, a bullfighter crew from 604 Squadron, slid into formation with deadly precision. Contact! The radar operator murmured from the rear cockpit, peering into the small green AI Mk.4 screen. Range 900 yards. Left there. The pilot squinted ahead as a shadow moved across the stars. A Dornier, invisible to the naked eye until the final second. Trigger squeezed. Cannons roared. The night lit up like a split-second sunrise. Another kill. Another blow to a strategy built on outdated assumptions. On the ground, radar picked up the falling wreck long before the crew heard the crash. The Japanese advisors would wake soon. Smoke curling from teacups, paper spread across desks, and wonder why their carefully crafted night doctrine was unraveling. But the answer wasn't in the skies. It was humming quietly in the British countryside, turning darkness into vision. Radar, dismissed, underestimated, mocked, was rewriting the rules of war. And the Japanese command didn't yet realize how much they'd miscalculated. Tokyo, Naval General Staff Headquarters. December 23rd, 1941. 9:12 hours. A cold wind rattled the paper screens along the hallway as Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome stepped into the strategy chamber. The table was already cluttered with maps of Europe, German situation reports, and blue-tinted aerial photographs of British coastline installations. Across the room, a German liaison officer, Major Ernst Vollmer, stood stiffly. His uniform was immaculate, but exhaustion deepened the shadows under his eyes. Fukudome sensed tension instantly. "What news from Paris?" he asked, voice smooth, diplomatic. Vollmer cleared his throat. "Our night raids are failing. Badly." He hesitated, a rare moment for a German officer speaking to an ally. "And we believe the reason is the British radar." The Japanese officers exchanged looks, some amused, others skeptical. To them, radar was a Western exaggeration, a concept overinflated by propaganda. They had inspected the British towers before, during pre-war intelligence gathering. Tall metal skeletons. Unimpressive. Certainly not the magical detection weapon the British claimed. Fukudome gestured for the German to continue. Vollmer stepped forward and placed a thin folder on the table. Inside, photos of the chain home stations, tall, rigid structures, supposedly the backbone of British early warning. These installations, the German officer said, track our bombers at night, at long range, even when cloud cover is complete, even when our crews fly at wave-top level. He paused, letting the gravity settle. It appears we underestimated them. A silence fell across the chamber. Fukadome's jaw tightened, not in anger, but something far more subtle. A small, growing realization. A threat previously dismissed, now demanding respect. He spoke quietly. "How sure are you?" Vollmer's response was immediate. "Every formation we've sent has been intercepted. Every night. The British are not reacting, they're waiting, as if they know our exact altitude and bearing." Another officer from the Japanese side leaned forward. "But these towers, they cannot see beyond the horizon. We have calculated." Vollmer cut him off politely, but firmly. "With respect, your calculations are outdated." He slid a second photograph across the table. This one showed the inside of a British radar operations room. Slightly blurry, taken by a German spy before the war. Dark and interior. Plotters moving on a giant map. Screens glowing with signals. Fukadome stared at the image. He had dismissed radar, because he had never seen the effect of radar. But the effect now stretched across the English Channel in wreckage and failure. "How far can the system reach?" he asked. Vollmer shook his head. "We don't know, and that is the danger." A quiet dread rippled through the room. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, December 23rd, 1941, Dover Radar Station, 048 hours British time. The radar operator, Alice Hayes, watched another cluster of returns. The night felt endless, but the rhythm had become familiar. Detect, track, intercept, report. Tonight, though, she noticed something new. "They're climbing," she murmured. "A slow climb, almost a test. They're probing the range limit." British radar officers had expected this. The Luftwaffe, and by extension their Japanese advisors, were no longer dismissing radar blindly. They were searching for weaknesses. Alice picked up the headset. "Control, Dover. Enemy altitude rising. Possibly testing our coverage." But even as she said it, the screen lit with a fresh line of returns. A faster-moving patrol sweeping in from the west. "Night fighters. Let them test," Wing Commander Farnham said over the line. "We'll give them the results." Alice smiled faintly. Radar wasn't just detection anymore. It was dominance. Tokyo, same moment, time difference accounted. The discussion inside the Naval General Staff had escalated. One officer slammed his fist onto the table. "The British cannot possibly track aircraft at night with such accuracy." Vollmer didn't raise his voice. He simply opened another document, a casualty report of the past week's German raids. Line after line listed bomber losses. "Tell that," he said coldly, "to the men who aren't coming back." The room fell silent. It was no longer theory, no longer curiosity. It was failure. And the Japanese command understood the implications clearly now. Radar was not a nuisance, not a gimmick, not a bluff. It was a battlefield weapon. And they had misjudged it from the very beginning. Fukadome exhaled slowly. "How do we counter it?" Vollmer shook his head. "At this moment, we don't." The realization hit like a blow. Night dominance, the one area Japan prided itself on, was slipping away. The British had turned darkness into a weapon, and the Japanese had barely begun to understand how. Fighter Command Operations Room, Uxbridge, England, December 24th, 1941, 103 hours. The giant plotting table glowed under a constellation of tiny bulbs as WAF plotters slid colored markers across the map. The tension of midnight operations filled the air, but there was a rhythm to it now. Britain had learned to fight in the dark. Above them, on the balcony, Group Captain Andrew Norris leaned over the railing, watching the incoming traces form on a large cathode display. The German formation was smaller tonight, more cautious, perhaps sensing something, perhaps realizing something. "Chain home, East reports first contact." Operator called out. Altitude 1,500 meters. Slow climb. Norris nodded calmly. They're testing us, he said. Let's show them they're not the only ones learning new tricks. He turned to his adjutant. Scramble the bow fighters at Tangmere. The order shot across the room like lightning. Moments later, the heavy twin-engine fighters roared into the night sky. Their onboard AI-MK, 4 radar sets, the latest evolution of Britain's air interception technology, powered up as they climbed. This was the part Japan never learned, never saw, never understood. Radar did not stop at the coastline. It traveled with the hunters over the channel. December 24th, 1941. The German bombers maintained strict radio silence as they crossed the dark waves. The crews scanned the black horizon for British fighters, silent shapes lurking in the moonlight. But nothing appeared. Inside one bomber, Oberfeldwebel Kruger wiped a hand across his brow. Too quiet, he muttered. His navigator frowned. We are below their radar range. At least the Japanese liaison officer said. A sudden voice crackled over the intercom from the rear gunner. Something's behind us. I thought. Then the intercom erupted with machine gun fire. The night exploded in flashes. A bowfighter had locked onto their position, using onboard radar. Not relying on searching skies, but hunting by invisible signal. The bomber shuddered under the attack. Kruger froze as the realization hit him. This is how they find us. This is how they always find us. The bomber spiraled downward, smoke pouring from its wing. Another formation behind it scattered in panic. The bullfighters moved like predators. Japan hadn't believed radar mattered. Germany had underestimated it. Britain had mastered it. Tokyo Naval Staff Headquarters. Later that day, the German liaison's final note had arrived. The room was silent as Fukudome read it. Intercepted again, he murmured. Every time again. He set the paper down slowly. This is no longer speculation. Commander Tadashi Ito, one of the few officers who had previously warned about Allied scientific progression, spoke carefully. Sir, the British have built a net over their entire island, a net of detection. And we, Fukudome said bitterly, laughed at the strings. Ito nodded. Our pilots believe they control the night. Now they walk into an invisible trap. Another officer leaned forward, whispering the thought too dangerous to say aloud. If radar is truly this powerful, then the war in the Pacific may not unfold as we imagine. Fukudome didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room felt it. This single mistake, this dismissal of radar, was no longer a European problem. It would follow Japan across oceans. Portsmouth, England. Same night, Alice Hayes stepped out of the operations room for a breath of cold winter air. The coastal wind cut through her uniform, but she smiled faintly as she looked over the dark sea. Another night raid defeated. Another test by the enemy answered. She hadn't fired a gun, hadn't flown a plane, hadn't dropped a bomb. But radar had made her a soldier in a new kind of war. A war fought with invisible lines across the sky. She looked back toward the glowing windows of the operations building. Let them laugh at the towers, she whispered. We'll keep the lamps lit. Far out to sea, the faint glow of burning aircraft reflected off clouds. The night, once owned by Japan's Naval Air Arm, now belonged to Britain. Imperial Japanese Navy Air Arsenal. Yokosuka, Japan. January 12, 1942. The winter rain drummed softly against the tin roof of the testing hangar as Lieutenant Commander Junichi Morita walked briskly across the concrete floor, boots echoing between the rows of disassembled bomb racks and half-finished prototypes. For weeks, rumors had circled from Europe, rumors of an invisible British weapon reshaping the night war, rumors that Japanese commanders had dismissed as nonsense from frightened pilots. Morita had believed the rumors. Tonight, he would prove them true. He approached a long table where engineers worked over a crude directional receiver, an experiment only half-sanctioned by the Admiralty. The device, a Frankenstein assembly of coils and vacuum tubes, hissed faintly as it warmed. Chief Engineer Nakamura looked up from his notebook. "You're late," he said. "I had to pass through 3 checkpoints," Morita answered. Security believes we're working on tailgun improvements. Nakamura snorted. Tailguns won't save us from ghosts in the sky. He pointed at the receiver. We detected British radar reflections from more than 30 miles offshore last night. Morita stiffened. That far? Their towers reach that far. No, Nakamura said quietly. Their frequencies reach that far. Morita's throat tightened. This was the truth they had failed to understand, one that the Germans had warned them about too late. Radar was not a tower. It was a network, a living system, and Britain had woven that system into every corner of the war. I thought their coverage only reached the channel, Morita muttered. Nakamura shook his head. That was 2 years ago. They've grown faster than we imagined. Their operators track aircraft before those aircraft even climbed to cruising altitude. Morita stared at the glowing receiver. So the losses over Germany, the failed night runs, all of that. Radar, Nakamura finished. A weapon we cannot see, cannot hear, and cannot trick with speed or darkness. Over the Himeji coast, that same night, 2 Japanese pilots, veterans returning from European liaison duty, flew a training run over the dark sea. Their aircraft, a Mitsubishi Ki-46 reconnaissance plane, hummed steadily as it cut through the wind. In the rear cockpit, Sergeant Fujita peered down at the lights of fishing villages below. This is the kind of night where we should be unstoppable, he called over the intercom. In Europe, the Germans used nights like this to disappear. The pilot, Lieutenant Sato, remained silent for a long moment. Then, not anymore. He flipped open his flight logbook. The page was filled with entries written in a tight, control hand. Losses, intercepts, unexplained downings. Britain sees everything, Sato said. Their fighters rose out of the darkness without lights, without errors, without guesses. It was as if they were following wires laid out in the sky. Fujita swallowed hard. They don't chase us, Sato whispered. They know where we're going. A chill crept through the cabin. If Britain could see in the dark, what did that mean for the vast Pacific? For Japan's own carefully planned night strategies? The war felt suddenly different. Smaller, tighter, less predictable. British radar tracking station. Poling, Sussex. Simultaneously, the rotation of the massive antenna created a low mechanical growl as it swept across the cold night. Inside the bunker, WAF operator Margaret Lowe adjusted her headphones and watched the oscilloscope flicker with faint contacts. She had no idea that her signal, her calm hand adjusting the gain knobs, was echoing across oceans. To her, it was just another shift, another scan, another night guarding the island. To the Japanese, it was the sound of their doctrine cracking. Her supervisor leaned over her shoulder. Anything unusual? Margaret turned a dial, isolating a new blip. Just a ferry plane heading toward Bristol. Civilian? Her supervisor nodded, satisfied. But had he known what the Japanese pilots believed, that Britain possessed supernatural night vision, he might have smiled. The truth was simpler, more humble, more powerful. Just people, machines, wires, discipline, a network of mines and metal stretching across a defended coastline. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. The next morning, a full emergency briefing had been called. Maps of Britain covered the walls. Charts of bomber losses lay scattered across tables. German liaison officers stood grimly along the back row. Admiral Osemi Nagano read the latest intelligence report aloud. British night interceptions have increased by 37% in the last quarter. Their success rate approaches certainty. He closed the folder. This is not a coincidence. Silence filled the room. Then Nagano said the words no one wanted to hear. We ridiculed their radar towers. We said they were useless. We said they were decorations. We were wrong. Morita stepped forward. Admiral, I have more to show you. The room turned toward him, fully alert. This was the moment Japan could no longer pretend the war was being fought by the same rules as before. The illusion had collapsed, and the night, once the Empire's greatest advantage, had turned against them. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo, January 13th, 1942, 14:10 hours. The briefing room felt unusually hot, not because of the winter sun filtering through the frosted windows, but because every senior officer in the room felt as though the walls were closing in. The air hung thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken fear. Lieutenant Commander Morita stepped to the center of the room, carrying a wooden case the length of a rifle. He placed it on the table, unlatched the brass clips, and opened it slowly. Inside lay a small receiver panel, a set of headphones, and a tightly wound antenna coil. A primitive radar detector. A copy, an imitation, of a device Britain had already mastered. Nagano leaned forward. "You built this." "Only a crude prototype," Morita replied. "But it is enough to show what our aircraft have been flying into." He looked around the room. "Gentlemen, until today we have been blind." He switched it on. The vacuum tubes warmed, glowing faint orange. A faint hum rose from the box, followed by sharp, pulsing ticks. Tick, 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 tick. Admiral Fukudomi straightened. "Is that—" "Yes," Morita said. A British chain home transmission, more than 5,000 miles away, bounced across the ionosphere. The room erupted in murmurs. "Our aircraft," Morita continued quietly, "never stood a chance." The Tokyo Air Defense Testing Range. 2 hours later. The sky over the test field was the color of dull metal as Morita led the delegation outside. A small forward control tower stood nearby, its cable snaking across the grass. Engineers moved nervously, setting up signal amplifiers and transformers. Morita gestured to the horizon. "Observe. Even here, half a world away, you will hear them." An assistant switched on the directional aerial and rotated it slowly. The receiver crackled to life again. Pulse, pulse, pulse. The signal grew louder, sharper. The Japanese officers looked astonished. "Those British towers," Morita said, "are not for show. They are not symbolic. They are the eyes of a nation." He turned toward the group of generals. "And the moment their operators see anything, they act." Inside a makeshift darkroom, near the range, Morita dimmed the lights and projected a film strip onto a small screen. It showed footage Germany had quietly shared with its Axis partners. Footage no one in this room had fully believed until now. The film showed a nighttime raid over Britain, twin-engine bombers moving through cloud, and then, seemingly without warning, twin-engine Beaufighters appearing out of the darkness like shadows with claws. The footage was silent, but the message was deafening. "AI airborne radar," Morita explained. "The British have placed miniature detection sets inside their fighters. They no longer patrol blindly. They hunt." He paused the film on a close-up of a British radar operator in the back of a Beaufighter, head tilted over a glowing, circular screen. "This," Morita said quietly, "is the man our pilots never see until it is too late." The Japanese commanders sat motionless. Even Nagano looked shaken. Imperial Navy Combined Air Staff. Later that evening, lights burned late into the night. Every map was updated, every doctrine reconsidered. A full reevaluation of night attack strategy was underway, and for the first time, Japanese commanders were not laughing. Commander Tadashi Ito, one of the few who had warned about Allied scientific capability before, approached Morita at the planning table. "You were right," Ito said softly. "We underestimated them." Morita nodded, but did not gloat. "Too many nations have made that mistake," he replied. "Germany, Italy, now us." Ito exhaled slowly. "What now?" Morita studied the diagrams of British radar arrays covering the coast like a spiderweb. "We change," he answered, "or the night sky becomes our grave." Somewhere over the East China Sea, that same night, a Japanese bomber formation flew without lights, testing new approach patterns. The crews whispered among themselves, still shaken by rumors from Europe. One pilot glanced at the moonlit water and murmured, "They say the British can see through storms now." His co-pilot swallowed. "They say their towers can see across the entire island." Neither man knew that Britain's radar net was expanding even faster than Japan's intelligence could track. Neither knew that the war was drifting toward a horizon shaped not by aircraft, not by ships, not by night raids, but by the invisible pulses of a new age, the age of radar. And Japan, once confident in darkness, was only now realizing it had entered that age completely unprepared. German Embassy, Tokyo, January 15th, 1942, 9:45 hours. Ambassador Eugen rarely summoned Japanese naval officers personally. When he did, it meant Berlin had something important, either an opportunity or a warning. This time it was both. Ito and Morita followed an aide to the embassy's narrow corridors until they reached a secure conference room. A German technician stood waiting beside a film projector, still warm from use. On the table lay a diplomatic pouch stamped with the Reichsadler, Geheime Reichsache. Ott gestured for them to sit. "Gentlemen," he began, "Germany has suffered heavy night losses. You've heard the reports. But what you do not yet know is the cause." Morita straightened. "The British airborne radar," he said. I gave a grave nod. "Correct, but there is more." He opened the pouch and slid out a stack of reconnaissance photographs, grainy aerial shots taken by high-altitude German planes. The first showed a British radar tower Morita recognized immediately. Chain home. But the next photograph was different. A shorter tower, more compact, rotating. Morita inhaled sharply. "Mobile radar," he whispered. I tapped the photo. "We call it GL Mark II, gun-laying radar. It directs anti-aircraft fire with extraordinary accuracy. Your night bombers are not only seen, they are measured, calculated, and shot at with mathematics." Ito leaned forward. "How widespread is this?" I'd spread out 6 more photos. Then 12. Then 20. A lattice of defensive nodes stretching across Britain. Germany had underestimated it. Japan had dismissed it. And Britain, quiet, steady, and stubbornly methodical, had kept building. I lit a cigarette. "We believe by the end of the year, they will have more radar stations than any nation on Earth." Morita exchanged a stunned look with Ito. "Ambassador," Morita said carefully, "why show us this now?" I gave a humorless smile. "Because Berlin believes Japan is about to make the same mistake we made in 1940. Imperial Navy Air Technical Arsenal, Yokosuka, January 16th, 1942. The atmosphere inside the technical arsenal was electric. Equal parts urgency and disbelief. Engineers rushed between drafting tables with new orders. Blackboards filled rapidly with equations. A team crowded around Morita's prototype radar detector. "You built this from salvage parts?" "Yes," Morita said, "but that is not enough. Japan must build her own radar laboratories, not as side projects, as a core arm of the war effort." A senior engineer frowned. "But the Navy told us British night fighter intercepts were just coincidence." Morita cut in sharply. "Luck? Pilot skill?" He shook his head. "No, we now have proof. This is science, not superstition." He pointed to a diagram of a Beaufighter's nose-mounted AI radar. "This is the enemy's advantage." He tapped a blueprint of a Japanese bomber. "This is our vulnerability." The room fell silent. Then, slowly, one by one, the engineers nodded. They understood. Meanwhile, British Air Defense Headquarters, Fighter Command, Stanmore, England. Snow clung to the telephone lines outside as the night watch monitored the channel quietly. In a dim corner of the operations room, a radar operator adjusted the dial on his console. A faint trace appeared. Possible track. Bearing 083, altitude unknown. The controller leaned over his shoulder. Range. Far. Very far. But steady. The British had no idea that Japanese observers had finally discovered the truth about their system. They also had no idea that Japan was now moving to adapt. But one thing remained certain. The British signal continued pulsing across the world. And every night it whispered the same message. "We see you." Japan had finally begun listening. December 20th, 1940. South coast of England. 23:41 hours. The night sky is thick with cloud, low, heavy, and waiting to swallow anything that dares to enter it. Searchlights carve through the darkness, their beams trembling like white blades. Along the hillside, the hum of a generator pulses through the frostbitten grass. Another radar station stands ready, its skeletal towers glinting with ice. Inside the operations hut, the air is warm, but the tension is not. Sergeant Lillian Godfrey, headset pressed against her ear, watches her oscilloscope twitch. Not wildly, not urgently, just enough to confirm what she already senses in the air. "They're coming again," she whispers. Behind her, Flight Lieutenant Thomas Harrow leans over the plotting table. Direction? Same as last week. Same as last night. They think the clouds will hide them. Harrow exhales sharply. Not tonight. Because tonight would be different. Tonight, RAF Fighter Command wasn't scrambling pilots in blind desperation. Tonight, squadrons weren't lifting off into empty sky, hoping to stumble across an enemy. Tonight, the defenders of Britain would launch with purpose, guided, coordinated, and deadly. Radar had changed everything. Godfrey tightens her jaw. Plot confirmed. 6, possibly 9 bogeys. Altitude high. Speed moderate. Looks like they're heading for Portsmouth. Harrow signals a runner, who bursts out into the frigid night to deliver the message to the communications tent. Across the coast, the radios crackle alive. Up at Tangmere Airfield, a pilot jolts awake to the sound of the scramble bell. Lights flood the runway. Mechanics sprint toward waiting fighters. Engines roar to life. Merlin's coughing, then rising into fierce metallic thunder. Night fighters to interception vector. Scramble, scramble, scramble. One by one, Hurricanes and the newer Beaufighters taxi out, wheels bouncing on the icy tarmac. Their cockpits glow pale blue from the instrument panels. Their pilots' gloved hands shake, not with fear but with adrenaline, because for the first time since the night war began, they have an advantage. A direction finder guides them. A radio beacon keeps them steady. But it's the voices from radar huts across the coast that shape their path through the black sky. Enemy has turned north. Enemy descending 2,000. Adjust course 250. Up above, Japanese reconnaissance officers attached to German Luftwaffe units as observers lean out the windows of Heinkel bombers, peering down through the thick cloud tops. They expect confusion, darkness, silence. What they find instead is opposition. Not scattered, not lucky, coordinated. When the first British night fighter streaks pass their formation, its silhouette flashing like a shadow blade, the Japanese observers are stunned. That can't be coincidence. Yet it is no coincidence. It is calibration, coordination, radar working as intended. Inside one Heinkel, Captain Masao Kumashiro grips the cold metal framing the window. "Impossible," he mutters. "We're above cloud. They shouldn't even know we're here." But the British know. They've known for 15 minutes. Another fighter sweeps in, this time firing. Streams of tracer arc across the dark sky, ripping holes of neon light in the cloud layer. Kumashiro's pilot jerks the bomber into a dive as engines scream in protest. Far below, Godfrey calls out new altitudes, new vectors, updating the fighters in real time. Sweat runs down her neck despite the cold. Her hands move instinctively over the console, calm, steady, authoritative. On radar, the enemy formation looks like a constellation beginning to break apart. On the ground, every operator can feel it. Tonight is a night the invincible illusion around enemy night operations finally cracks. Up above, the Japanese observers watch in disbelief as one bomber spirals down in a flaming arc. Another peels off, damaged. A third tries to escape south, but a Beaufighter cuts across its path like a hunting falcon. Kumashiro's heart sinks. This was no stroke of luck. This was a system, a network, an invisible architecture of detection and response. A weapon they had laughed at, a weapon they had dismissed as unimportant antenna towers. And now that weapon was hunting them. The bomber shudders under fire. Instruments fail. Oxygen masks hiss. The airframe groans. Kumashiro grips his seat, knuckles white. It is no longer a night raid. It is a rout, a defeat unfolding in the dark. And in that moment, high above the British coastline, Japanese officers finally grasp the truth. Radar isn't theory. Radar isn't British bluff. Radar is real. Radar is lethal. Radar is the reason their night strategy is crumbling beneath them. On the coast, Godfrey lifts her headset, finally exhaling. Multiple enemy aircraft retreating, she reports. Britain holds tonight. Harrow nods, a faint smile forming. It's only the beginning. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo, January 17th, 1942, 8:15 hours. The morning sunlight filtered through the rice paper windows, but it did little to lift the heaviness in the room. Maps of the Pacific, Europe, and the English Channel were spread across the central table, but the officers could hardly focus on geography. Their attention was fixed on a single, unavoidable fact: radar. Admiral Osemi Nagano stood at the head of the table, fingers steepled, eyes narrowed. Around him, senior staff fidgeted in their seats. Intelligence reports lay open. Night raid after night raid, German and Japanese aircraft alike fall into unseen forces in the darkness. Nagano's voice cut through the murmurs. We ridiculed this instrument. We mocked it. And we sent our pilots and crews into the night, believing the enemy blind. A junior officer cleared his throat. Admiral, the European reports confirm Luftwaffe formations that follow Japanese doctrine are losing almost every mission. Nagano did not flinch. Yes, and the lesson must be absorbed. This is no longer a peripheral tool. Radar is a weapon, one that can dominate space, time, and darkness. It can replace sight, intuition, even experience. He turned to Morita, who had just arrived with diagrams and calculations. Commander Morita, you have witnessed their operation firsthand? Morita nodded gravely. Yes, sir. British chain home stations, mobile gun-laying units, airborne AI radar. We have measured their reach. We have tracked their operators' response times. They see and act with precision we cannot match at present. Nagano exhaled slowly. Then we are faced with a stark choice. We either adapt or continue to walk blind into the night and pay with lives. RAF Fighter Command, Stanmore, England, January 17th, 1942, 1:57 hours. The night was unusually calm, the air almost warm with deceptive stillness. Radar operators at Stanmore leaned over glowing displays, tracking a small formation of German bombers approaching the southeastern coast. Plotter Lieutenant Margaret Lowe noted each blip as it moved steadily across the screen. Her fingers flew over switches, correcting for drift, calculating speed, and relaying precise vectors to night fighters waiting miles above the clouds. Altitude 2,000 feet. Heading northeast, she called into the intercom. Vector, interception 23-0. Angels 12. Intercept time 90 seconds. The bullfighters roared to life. On board, radar operators guided pilots silently, the green screens reflecting their focused expressions. In the air, nothing in the darkness was accidental. Every maneuver, every climb, every turn was calculated, predicted, countered. Below, the bombers were unaware of the invisible web closing around them. They had trained for night raids. They had flown blind assaults in Europe. But Britain's network had matured. Now it could anticipate, track, and destroy before the enemy even realized they were seen. One bomber's engine screamed as it was hit. Tracer fire carved streaks of light across the black sky. Another pulled into a desperate spiral. And still, more British fighters emerged from clouds, perfectly vectored by unseen hands. The operators remained calm. The pilots followed instructions. The night, once Japan's ally, had become Britain's battlefield. Tokyo Naval Staff Headquarters. That same afternoon, the realization of radar's dominance had spread through the staff. Morita presented further calculations, British coverage along the channel, detection probability curves, response times of night fighters. The room was silent. Nagano finally broke the quiet. Every night we send our men into darkness. We risk what we saw in Europe. Total operational failure. Radar has transformed the night into a battlefield we cannot fight blindly. The enemy's success is systematic. It is technological. It is inevitable unless we adapt immediately. Ito, a seasoned strategist, leaned forward. Admiral, if we ignore this, we doom our pilots before they ever reach enemy airspace. Even in the Pacific, the principle will hold. Night is no longer a shield. Nagano's gaze was distant, fixed on the maps of Europe and the Channel. We laughed at towers we did not understand, and now we see the cost of ignorance. Japan must build, learn, and adapt, or darkness itself will betray us. A hush fell. For the first time, the Japanese command understood that the war had changed, not in strategy, not in numbers, but in science. Dover Radar Station, England. Nightfall, January 17, 1942. The green sweeps of radar screens pulsed silently across the operations room. Operators observed aircraft approaching the channel. Every blip, every movement was cataloged. Commands flowed over radios. Fighters responded instantly. Alice Hayes, headset in place, watched another formation of enemy bombers crumble under invisible fire. The British had not fired first. They had not guessed. They had known. A single thought passed through her mind. We see you. And that was enough. Radar had changed the war. The enemy had laughed. The British had waited. And now, in the darkness, they held the advantage. The night sky had shifted its allegiance. Britain had turned the invisible into the invincible. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. January 18, 1942. 10:03 hours. The conference room was unusually quiet. Maps, reports, and aerial photographs lay scattered across the long table. But the officers' eyes were fixed on the words and images Morita had presented. Radar was no longer theoretical. It was a weapon that had reshaped entire campaigns in Europe and would inevitably affect Japan's own operations across the Pacific. Admiral Nagano stood at the head of the table, his hands pressed to the wood. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of unspoken dread. We mock what we cannot see. We dismiss the technology because it did not conform to our expectations of battle. And in doing so, we allowed the enemy to build a fortress in the night itself. Commander Ito spoke carefully, as if voicing a truth the others were reluctant to accept. Sir, our pilots, our strategists, they believe night offered concealment, but the British have proven that darkness is not safety. It is merely another medium in which to fight, and we are blind. Nagano nodded. It is not just Europe. The Pacific will be no different. Islands, coastlines, night raids, they all become domains where the enemy can see without being seen. Morita stepped forward. We can build our own systems, sir. We can adapt. But time is short. We cannot afford mistakes. Every night we send men into darkness without detection equipment. We risk the same fate Europe has suffered. The room was still. The reality was unavoidable. Japan had underestimated radar, and that underestimation had cost lives. It had reshaped the rules of engagement. It had turned a once predictable night war into a lethal and unknowable battlefield. RAF Fighter Command, England, January 18, 1942, 1:15 hours. The night was calm, but the operators remained vigilant. Each screen was a pulse of intelligence, each blip a potential threat. British fighters moved efficiently across the skies, vectored by the invisible hands of radar operators who had learned to anticipate every move of the enemy. WAF plotter Margaret Lowe watched a bomber formation approach from the continent. Their silhouettes were barely visible through the cloud cover, but the operators knew exactly where to guide the interceptors. Altitude 2,000, heading 200, vector interception 250. Seconds later, the first Beaufighter cut through the clouds. Tracers carved streaks of fire into the darkness. One by one, the bombers faltered. The night, once a refuge for enemy forces, belonged to Britain, and every pulse from the radar screens whispered the same message. We see you. We always see you. Pacific Islands, Japanese outposts. February 1942. Whispers reached the front lines. Officers spoke cautiously of a European lesson, of the invisible technology that had allowed a small island nation to dominate the night sky. Stories of the chain home stations, AI airborne radar, and systematic interceptions traveled like ghostly warnings. A Japanese pilot, writing in his logbook under dim lamplight, reflected, "We believed night was ours, darkness our ally." Yet across the world, a nation of observers watches and guides as hunters. Every shadow we thought concealed us becomes an open highway for death. We have laughed at towers, at wires, at blinking lights, and they have returned the laughter with blood. The officer closed his book and stared into the blackness beyond the encampment. The jungle seemed quieter now, heavier with awareness. Supplies could fail, bombs could miss, but this invisible weapon would never sleep. Radar had arrived, and Japan had learned its lesson too late. Dover Radar Station, England. Nightfall, February 1942. The operator's hands flew over the consoles, adjusting, calculating, guiding. Pilots obeyed instructions. Aircraft moved with precision. The night belonged to the defenders. Alice Hayes leaned back for a moment, eyes on the horizon. Snow dusted the ground. The wind whispered through the radar towers. But inside, warmth radiated from the confidence born of knowledge and preparation. The invisible line stretched across the country, across the sea, across time. One truth had become undeniable. Technology, discipline, and foresight had turned what the enemy dismissed into an unstoppable shield. The towers, once laughed at, had become the silent sentinels of Britain. Their pulse had changed the course of the war. And every night thereafter, as aircraft tried to move unseen, radar ensured that the darkness was no longer a refuge. A lesson learned too late by those who had mocked it, and a weapon Britain wielded with unerring precision.